For years, people believed that modern banking systems were untouchable pillars of security. Most ordinary citizens assumed that as long as they followed the law, worked hard, paid taxes, and kept their money inside regulated institutions, their financial access could never suddenly disappear. But in recent years, a growing number of incidents have started exposing a darker reality hiding underneath the surface of modern finance. A reality where governments, regulators, and giant corporations possess enormous power to decide who gets to fully participate in the financial system and who can instantly be pushed outside of it. The term debanking once sounded like a conspiracy theory to many people. Most assumed it only happened to criminals, terrorists, or organizations directly involved in illegal activity. But the conversation changed dramatically when public figures, entrepreneurs, journalists, political activists, and even ordinary citizens began reporting that their bank accounts were suddenly frozen or permanently closed. And once people realized this could happen without criminal convictions or transparent legal processes, fear about financial control started spreading much faster. One of the biggest moments that pushed this conversation into mainstream attention happened during a discussion on the Joe Rogan Experience featuring Mark Andreessen. The discussion moved far beyond cryptocurrency prices or investment trends and instead focused on something much more serious: the growing ability of institutions to financially silence people by removing their access to banking infrastructure entirely. And for millions listening to that conversation, it forced an uncomfortable realization about how fragile financial freedom may actually be. Andreessen described debanking as a situation where either a person or an entire company gets completely removed from the banking system, not just inconvenienced temporarily, but fully cut off from basic financial services that modern life depends on every single day. Checking accounts disappear, credit cards stop functioning, transfers become impossible, and businesses suddenly lose the ability to operate normally. In a world where nearly every transaction depends on digital banking rails, that kind of exclusion can completely destroy someone's economic life overnight. The discussion referenced the case of Kanye West, whose banking relationships reportedly collapsed after controversial public statements. Whether people agreed with his views or not was almost secondary to the larger issue being discussed. The real concern was the precedent that major institutions could effectively isolate someone financially once political or public pressure became strong enough, and that raised a disturbing question many listeners had never seriously considered before. What actually happens to someone once they are removed from the financial system? Where do they keep their money if banks refuse to work with them? How do they pay employees, buy necessities, or continue running businesses when their accounts suddenly vanish? And perhaps most frightening of all, who exactly decides when someone deserves to lose access to the modern economy? The conversation became even more intense when Andreessen claimed that some individuals connected to the tech and crypto industries had experienced similar treatment. He described situations where entrepreneurs allegedly struggled to maintain banking relationships, simply because regulators or institutions viewed them as politically risky or undesirable. According to him, many founders spent years repeatedly applying for new accounts, while hoping some institution would eventually agree to work with them again. For listeners, it sounded less like a modern democracy and more like a system capable of quietly punishing people behind closed doors. What made the issue especially alarming was the absence of clear transparency. In many of these stories, people claimed there were no formal charges, no court hearings, and no obvious legal process explaining why they lost banking access. Instead, institutions simply closed accounts while offering vague references to risk management, compliance policies, or regulatory obligations. And because banks are private companies, they often maintain broad authority over whom they choose to serve. This creates an unusual gray area where governments may not directly censor someone themselves, but pressure can still influence private institutions to take action indirectly. Critics argue that this structure allows authorities to distance themselves publicly while still achieving the same result through corporate partnerships and regulatory influence. Supporters of strict financial oversight argue that banks must manage risks carefully and comply with laws designed to combat fraud, money laundering, and extremism. But regardless of where people stand politically, the conversation revealed just how much hidden power exists inside modern financial systems. For most citizens, banking feels invisible because it functions automatically in the background of daily life. People swipe cards, send payments, receive salaries, pay mortgages, and move money globally without ever thinking deeply about the infrastructure making it all possible. But the moment access disappears, modern life can unravel with terrifying speed. Rent payments fail, businesses freeze, payroll stops, and basic survival suddenly becomes difficult in ways many never imagined. That fear is one of the reasons Bitcoin supporters continue emphasizing financial sovereignty as a core principle behind decentralized money. To many outsiders, Bitcoin appears primarily as a speculative investment driven by price volatility and social media hype. But longtime advocates argue that its true value lies elsewhere entirely. Not in number go up technology, but in the ability to hold wealth outside centralized control structures. As Bitcoin climbed once again toward the psychologically important $100,000 level, excitement across financial markets returned rapidly. Large institutional investors, corporations, ETFs, and wealthy holders continued accumulating massive amounts of Bitcoin during market pullbacks. Charts showed whales buying thousands of coins, even during temporary corrections, signaling extremely strong long-term conviction among major market participants. And with demand continuing to rise, optimism surrounding Bitcoin's future intensified across the entire industry. Yet, during bullish periods, many investors become distracted by price action alone. The conversation shifts almost entirely toward profit targets, market cycles, and predictions about how high Bitcoin might climb next. But advocates argue that focusing only on price misses the deeper reason Bitcoin was created in the first place. Because Bitcoin emerged directly out of distrust toward centralized financial power following the global financial crisis of 2008. Its creator, Satoshi Nakamoto, introduced a system designed to operate independently of governments, banks, and centralized monetary authorities. Transactions could occur peer-to-peer without requiring approval from traditional institutions. Ownership depended on private cryptographic keys rather than permission from financial intermediaries. And most importantly, properly self-custodied Bitcoin could not easily be frozen or confiscated through the same mechanisms used in traditional banking. This distinction became particularly important during moments of political and social unrest around the world. One major example frequently referenced by Bitcoin advocates occurred during the 2022 Canadian trucker protests. As demonstrations escalated, authorities took aggressive financial measures against certain organizers and donors connected to the movement. Some bank accounts were reportedly frozen, and payment platforms became heavily scrutinized during the government response. For Bitcoin supporters, the event demonstrated how quickly financial systems can become tools of political enforcement during crises. People who donated relatively small amounts through traditional payment platforms suddenly discovered that financial transactions are never truly neutral inside centralized systems. Every payment passes through institutions capable of monitoring, restricting, or reversing access when pressure intensifies. And once citizens understand that reality, many begin searching for alternatives beyond traditional banking rails. Bitcoin supporters argue that self-custodied cryptocurrency changes this equation fundamentally. When someone controls their own private keys through personal wallets, no bank executive or regulator can instantly freeze access in the same way. Funds can move globally without needing approval from centralized gatekeepers, provided internet access still exists. And that independence is precisely what attracts people worried about censorship, authoritarianism, or growing institutional overreach. Of course, critics respond that decentralized systems also carry serious risks. Private key management can be difficult, scams remain common, and irreversible transactions create vulnerabilities for inexperienced users. Governments additionally argue that completely unregulated financial systems could facilitate criminal activity, sanctions, evasion, and illicit transactions across borders. So the debate surrounding financial freedom versus financial oversight remains deeply controversial and politically charged. Still, the psychological appeal of sovereign money continues growing as trust in institutions weakens globally. Inflation crises, banking collapses, political polarization, sanctions regimes, and increasing surveillance have all contributed to rising skepticism towards centralized control. More people now question whether their wealth is truly theirs if access ultimately depends on institutional approval. And once that question enters public consciousness, it becomes very difficult to fully erase. The discussion on Rogan's podcast became especially revealing when Joe Rogan asked a simple but devastating question. If someone with millions of dollars gets debanked, where exactly are they supposed to put their money? Andreessen responded half-jokingly about storing cash under mattresses, buying art, or moving wealth overseas. But for many listeners, that answer sounded shockingly primitive for the modern digital age. Imagine spending decades building a successful business only to suddenly lose access to financial infrastructure overnight. Even if your assets technically still exist somewhere, daily functionality collapses almost immediately. Without active accounts, modern commerce becomes incredibly difficult because nearly every system now depends on electronic payments and institutional verification. And the richer or more visible someone becomes, the more exposed they may feel to political or reputational targeting. This is where Bitcoin advocates believe decentralized assets provide a powerful alternative. Unlike physical cash, Bitcoin can move globally within minutes without needing armored trucks, border declarations, or physical storage facilities. Unlike fine art, it can be divided precisely and transferred digitally across enormous distances. And unlike traditional bank balances, properly secured Bitcoin holdings cannot simply be frozen through a phone call between regulators and financial institutions. Supporters frequently repeat one phrase that has become almost a mantra inside the Bitcoin community: not your keys, not your Bitcoin. The meaning behind the phrase is simple but extremely important in crypto culture. If someone else controls the private keys to your digital assets, then you do not truly possess full sovereignty over them. This is why many hardcore Bitcoin supporters distrust centralized exchanges and even Bitcoin ETFs despite their growing popularity. While ETFs provide easy exposure to Bitcoin's price movement for traditional investors, they still rely heavily on institutional custody structures. Users do not directly control the underlying private keys themselves. And because of that, critics argue ETFs recreate many of the same centralized dependencies Bitcoin was originally designed to escape. The same criticism extends toward leaving Bitcoin permanently on centralized exchanges. Although exchanges offer convenience, they also introduce counterparty risk, because customers depend on companies to safeguard assets responsibly. History has shown repeated examples of exchanges collapsing, freezing withdrawal, or suffering catastrophic hacks that wiped out customer funds entirely. And each crisis reinforces the argument that true financial sovereignty only exists through personal self-custody. At the same time, mainstream adoption continues accelerating rapidly, despite ideological disagreements inside the crypto world. Large financial institutions that once mocked Bitcoin are now actively accumulating exposure through ETFs and corporate treasury strategies. Major investment firms increasingly describe Bitcoin as a legitimate alternative asset class alongside gold and traditional commodities. And every new wave of institutional participation pushes Bitcoin further into global financial relevance. Yet, ironically, Bitcoin's growing institutional acceptance may also dilute some of its original anti-establishment identity, as giant corporations and Wall Street funds accumulate larger positions. Critics worry that centralized influence could slowly reshape the ecosystem over time. Some fear Bitcoin may eventually become another heavily financialized asset controlled primarily by elites rather than ordinary individuals. And that tension between decentralization and institutional adoption continues shaping debates throughout the crypto community. Still, no matter how large institutional involvement becomes, one feature remains uniquely powerful. Anyone anywhere in the world can still hold Bitcoin independently without requiring permission from governments or banks. That accessibility continues attracting people living under unstable regimes, inflationary currencies, or restrictive financial systems. For them, Bitcoin often represents far more than speculation because it can function as economic survival infrastructure. Around the world, examples continue emerging of individuals using cryptocurrency during periods of political instability or banking dysfunction. Citizens facing hyperinflation, sanctions, or capital controls have increasingly explored digital assets as alternative stores of value. In some countries, people already distrust local currencies so deeply that decentralized assets feel safer despite volatility risks. And each economic crisis adds new audiences willing to reconsider how money itself should function in the modern era. At its core, the entire debate surrounding debanking and Bitcoin revolves around one fundamental issue: control. Who ultimately controls access to wealth, transactions, and economic participation in society? Governments and institutions, or individuals themselves? Traditional financial systems prioritize oversight, compliance, and centralized management. They argue these mechanisms protect societies from fraud, terrorism, financing, tax evasion, and systemic instability. But critics warn that concentrating too much power inside centralized institutions inevitably creates opportunities for abuse and political manipulation. And once technological systems become capable of monitoring every transaction, financial freedom can quickly become conditional rather than absolute. Bitcoin attempts to shift that balance back toward individuals by removing trusted intermediaries from the equation entirely, instead of relying on banks to verify balances and process transactions. Decentralized consensus mechanisms secure the network collectively. Ownership exists cryptographically rather than institutionally. And while governments can regulate exchanges or restrict access points, they cannot easily alter Bitcoin's underlying protocol itself. This does not mean Bitcoin is perfect or immune to criticism. Volatility remains extreme, scams continue damaging the industry's reputation, and technological complexity still creates barriers for average users. Environmental concerns surrounding mining operations have also sparked major global debates for years. But despite these criticisms, Bitcoin's resilience continues surprising even long-time skeptics. Every major crash, regulatory crackdown, or declaration of Bitcoin's death has ultimately failed to eliminate the network. Instead, adoption gradually expanded across new demographics, countries, and institutional sectors over time. What began as a niche internet experiment evolved into a trillion-dollar asset class influencing global financial discussions at the highest levels. And the more centralized trust weakens globally, the stronger Bitcoin's core narrative appears to become. For ordinary people watching these developments unfold, the situation can feel deeply confusing. On one side stand governance and financial institutions, insisting strong regulation is necessary for stability and security. On the other side stand decentralization advocates, warning that unchecked centralized control threatens basic economic freedom itself. And somewhere between those competing visions lies the uncertain future of money in the digital age. What makes the debate especially emotional is that money touches every aspect of human survival. Housing, food, transportation, healthcare, education, and opportunity all depend on reliable financial access. So when people hear stories about individuals being suddenly excluded from banking systems, fear naturally follows regardless of political ideology, because everyone understands how devastating financial isolation could become personally. The rise of digital currencies, surveillance technologies, and programmable financial systems will likely intensify these debates even further in coming years. Central bank digital currencies, AI-driven monitoring systems, and increasingly sophisticated compliance infrastructure may dramatically reshape how transactions are tracked and controlled globally. Supporters believe these innovations could reduce crime and improve efficiency across economies. Critics fear they could create unprecedented systems of financial surveillance and behavioral control. In that environment, Bitcoin supporters increasingly present decentralized assets as a form of financial insurance against uncertain futures, not necessarily as replacements for all traditional systems, but as parallel alternatives capable of existing outside centralized authority structures. Many advocates no longer frame Bitcoin primarily as a get-rich-quick investment opportunity. Instead, they describe it as protection against institutional fragility, inflation, censorship, and political unpredictability. Whether those fears ultimately prove justified remains heavily debated. But one thing has clearly changed over the last decade. Questions about financial sovereignty that once seemed fringe now increasingly enter mainstream political and economic conversations around the world. And once societies begin questioning who truly controls money, the implications become enormous. The conversation sparked by Rogan and Andreessen resonated because it tapped into something deeper than crypto speculation alone. It exposed growing anxieties about institutional power, political polarization, and the vulnerability of individuals inside highly centralized systems. For many listeners, the issue was not whether they personally supported Bitcoin or even liked cryptocurrency at all. The issue was realizing how dependent modern life has become on systems ordinary people do not actually control. As Bitcoin continues pushing toward new highs and global adoption expands further, its biggest test may not be technological anymore. The real battle could center around philosophy, governance, and the future relationship between citizens and institutional power. Will financial systems become increasingly centralized, monitored, and permission-based over time? Or will decentralized alternatives carve out lasting space for individual sovereignty in the digital age? No one knows exactly how that struggle will unfold over the coming decades. But the debate itself is no longer disappearing. Every banking controversy, censorship dispute, sanctions regime, or financial crises pushes more people to reconsider assumptions they once took for granted about money and freedom. And each time that happens, Bitcoin's original value proposition becomes harder for the world to ignore.